Let's start with a number that should make you stop and think. Before France arrived in 1830, Algerian communities owned nearly all of their country's fertile land. It was theirs. They farmed it, lived on it, and passed it down through generations. By the time Algeria finally won its independence in 1962, a tiny minority of European settlers, less than 10% of the population, controlled almost half of all cultivated land. Not just any land, mind you, but the best, most valuable, most water-rich land in the entire country. This wasn't a business deal. This was a heist, executed over 132 years on a national scale. It was a slow-motion robbery where an entire country's most precious asset was systematically stripped away from its people. So, how did France pull it off? How do you take a country's land from its people? You do it with laws that sound official, but are designed for theft. When the French first arrived, most land in Algeria wasn't owned with a deed in a filing cabinet, like in Europe. It was held collectively by tribes' families, a system that had worked for centuries. The French military government declared untitled land vacant and belonging to the state. Huge areas of pasture community farmland were suddenly up for grabs. The state handed them to French settlers, the colons. A legal trick, a shell game with people's livelihoods. Then came targeted attacks on property. After uprisings, the French punished whole communities by confiscating land. If your village fought back, you risked prison death and losing the land your family had lived on for generations. The land was sold for a pittance or handed to new settlers from France, Italy, Spain. A new class of European landowners rose on the ashes of Algerian resistance. Algerian farmers became landless laborers, working for miserable wages on their former fields. The injustice was baked into every rule. The Senatus Consulte of 1863 was introduced. It aimed to break up tribal land into individual plots. On paper, modernization. In reality, disaster. The theft didn't stop with the land. Once France had control of the fields, it turned its attention to everything under them and everything that passed through them. Iron ore, phosphates, zinc, oil, natural gas in the Sahara. The colonial administration granted rights almost exclusively to French companies. The mines were dug, the drills were set up. A massive industrial machine was built to fuel metropolitan France. The profits flowed in one direction, north across the Mediterranean. Picture it as pipes carrying wealth out of Algeria to France. The French built roads, railways, and ports, but those routes didn't connect Algerian towns for local trade. Instead, they formed funnels to the seaports. Algiers, Oran, Beaune. Everything was streamlined for export. Wheat, wine, fruits, minerals, loaded onto ships bound for Marseille. Meanwhile, Algerian producers often struggled with food shortages and poverty. The financial system was rigged. The banks in Algeria were branches of French banks. They provided loans to European settlers, but it was incredibly difficult for an Algerian to get credit. The currency was the French franc, tying Algeria's economy to France. Taxes were another tool of extraction. Algerians were heavily taxed, but that money wasn't used for schools or hospitals. It was used to pay for the colonial administration, the police, and the infrastructure that served the French settlers and the export economy. It was like being forced to pay for the construction of your own cage. Even after oil and gas were discovered in the Sahara in the 1950s, the story remained the same. That was a potential jackpot that could have transformed Algeria's future. Instead, concessions were granted to French oil companies who reaped enormous profits. The French government fought so hard to keep Algeria partly because it did not want to lose control of that energy. The plunder wasn't just a 19th century event, it was an ongoing project, adapting to extract every last drop until the end. Algeria was made rich in resources, but its people were kept poor by design. So yeah, that's the hard truth. Section 4. A life of shadows, the daily humiliation of colonial rule. Beyond the grand theft of land and resources was the slow, grinding erosion of daily life and human dignity. For the vast majority of Algerians, French rule meant living as second-class citizens in the land of their birth. This wasn't just a feeling, it was legally enforced. The Code de l'Indigénat, or Native Code, was a set of special laws that applied only to the indigenous population. It gave colonial administrators the power to punish Algerians without a trial for a whole list of offenses, like speaking disrespectfully to a colonial official, failing to show proper deference. It was a system of arbitrary power designed to keep people in a constant state of fear and submission. This inequality was visible everywhere. In the cities, neighborhoods were segregated. The French settlers lived in beautiful European-style city centers with wide boulevards, modern amenities, and clean water. Just a short distance away, Algerians were crowded into sprawling kasbahs, newly built shantytowns known as bidonvilles. They suffered from poor sanitation, overcrowded housing, limited access to basic services. A child's future was largely determined by their origin. A French child went to a well-funded school that prepared them for a position of authority. An Algerian child, if they went to school at all, often attended an underfunded institution where they were taught in French and learned a history that glorified their colonizers. The cultural suppression was just as painful. The French colonial project was built on the idea that French culture was superior. The Arabic language was marginalized in public life. The Berber language was marginalized in public life. They were pushed out of government offices, courts, schools. Traditional Islamic education, which had been the backbone of Algerian society for centuries, was dismantled. Religious institutions had their lands confiscated and their influence curtailed. For many Algerians, it felt like their very identity was under attack. They were being told, in countless subtle and overt ways, that their language, their faith, and their way of life were backward and needed to be replaced. Imagine, the psychological weight of this every single day. Section 5, The Story of Fatima, a personal glimpse into loss. To understand what this history really means, we must move beyond the big numbers and look at a single life. Let's talk about a woman we'll call Fatima. Born in a small village near Sétif in the 1920s. Her family didn't own a grand estate, but they had enough. A few hectares where they grew wheat, barley, a small olive grove, goats. Her childhood matched the rhythms of the seasons, planting, harvesting, festivals that followed. Her world was her village, her family, the land that had sustained them for generations, a life of simple dignity. Then, when Fatima was a girl, that world began to crumble. A French settler, backed by colonial administration, laid claim to a large tract including her family's fields. He had papers, a surveyor, the protection of the local police. Fatima's father and village elders protested. They showed traditional markers. They explained the land had always been theirs. Their words counted for nothing against the colonial state. The family was displaced. They kept a tiny, rocky plot on a hillside, barely enough to grow anything. The best land, the land her grandfather had worked, became a vast vineyard. Fatima's life was changed forever. Her father, once a proud farmer, now sought work as a day laborer on the estate that took his land. He was paid a pittance. Fatima, instead of learning her mother's traditions, was sent as a domestic servant in the settler's house as a teenager. She cleaned the floors, washed the clothes, for a family living in comfort on her family's stolen inheritance. She watched their children go to school while her own brothers received no education. She bore the daily humiliation of serving those who had taken everything from her. Her story is not unique. It is the story of millions. The personal, intimate cost of colonialism. A broken link between a people and their land. Dignity replaced with servitude. Fatima saw her family go from self-sufficient to dependent and poor. She saw her culture pushed to the margins. her language treated as inferior in her own home. Section 6. The unquenchable fire, resistance, and repression. The Algerian people did not passively accept their fate. From the very beginning of the French conquest in 1830, there was resistance. Emir Abdelkader led a fierce armed struggle against the French army for years. He became a symbol of Algerian defiance. When early uprisings were crushed by France's superior firepower, the resistance changed form. It moved into the mosques, where imams preached about justice. It moved into poems. It moved into songs. It lived in the quiet, stubborn refusal to forget. As the 20th century dawned, resistance became more political. Intellectuals and activists formed organizations demanding rights and representation. Ferhat Abbas at first called for assimilation and equality within the French system. France repeatedly denied meaningful reform, showing equality under colonial rule was an illusion. The brutal French response to peaceful protests, Sétif and Guelma in 1945, where thousands were killed. This history of broken promises and repression led to the formation of the National Liberation Front, the FLN, in 1954. The FLN demanded complete independence and prepared to fight for it. The war that followed was one of the most brutal of decolonization. The FLN used guerrilla tactics, targeting colonial infrastructure. They targeted symbols of French authority. The fight mobilized men. The fight mobilized women. It spread across the countryside. It reached the Casbahs of the cities. France's reaction was total war. The French government deployed 500,000 soldiers. They used helicopters. They used napalm. They forcibly relocated millions into camps. The French military systematically used torture to extract information and terrorize people. The Battle of Algiers, 1957, became a chilling example. French paratroopers in the capital, electrocution, waterboarding, summary executions. The French fought with extreme brutality to keep Algeria, revealing how much they stood to lose and how little they valued Algerian lives. Section 7. Scars and Seeds, the Legacy of Plunder and the Path Forward. In 1962, after a war that cost hundreds of thousands of Algerian lives, the French flag was finally lowered. Algeria was free. But independence was not a magic wand. It could not instantly erase 132 years of colonial plunder. The new nation was born scarred. It inherited an economy designed to serve France, not Algeria. Its most fertile lands were still organized into huge estates. Many were abandoned by fleeing settlers. The new government struggled with how to redistribute them. The country lacked trained engineers, doctors, administrators. The work of building a nation had to start from near zero. The legacy of this history is not confined to the past. It is alive and present. It lives in the complex, often tense relationship between France and Algeria today. It lives in debates over apologies, reparations, the return of cultural artifacts held in French museums. It lives in the stories of the Harkis, Algerians who fought for the French and were abandoned by both sides. It lives in the millions of French citizens of Algerian descent, who navigate a complicated identity between two countries forever linked by this painful history. The plunder of Algeria created wounds so deep they continue to shape politics, society, and family stories on both sides of the Mediterranean. So, what is the message in all of this? It is simple but powerful. We must tell the truth about the past. The story of colonial plunder cannot be hidden behind gentle words or forgotten in the name of moving on. Acknowledging the injustice is the first step. Recognizing that the wealth of one nation was built on the poverty of another is essential for an honest accounting of history. Forgetting this story is not an option. The same patterns of extraction and inequality continue in different forms around the world today. This history is a warning. It shows what happens when power goes unchecked and humanity is ignored. But this is not just a story of victimhood. It is also a profound story of resilience. The Algerian people survived. They fought for their freedom against overwhelming odds. They are rebuilding their nation, reclaiming their language, telling their own stories. There is hope in that. The final action, then, is one of remembrance and respect. We must listen to the stories of those who suffered like Fatima. We must teach this history honestly to our children, and we must commit ourselves to a future where no nation's prosperity is ever again built upon the plunder of another. That is the only way to truly honor the past and build a just future.